So, how would you define this? Hopefully it's not too difficult. We know psychological disorders are what type of conditions? Health conditions. Same as diabetes, heart disease. So please don't in your mind have a category of mental health conditions and physiological, because all physiological conditions have psychological effects, and all psychological conditions have some degree of causality, either majorly or minorly, in physiology. And for the rest of the definitions blanks, they would negatively impact how we, if you're thinking, think, act, and feel. Exactly. So you could have think or cognition, you could have feeling or emotion, or you could have cognitions, or we did that, cognitions or thought, and last one would be behaviors or actions. They are diagnosed with a DSM. D, was that deterministic or definitional? Hopefully you went with diagnostic. S, symptomological, statistical. Hopefully you went with statistical. And M, manual. So we've just finished our discussion of anxiety disorders. In AppPsych, you would get typically a whole chapter on anxiety disorders. We also mentioned one stress and trauma-related disorder. You'd also get a more lengthy discussion in AppPsych about that particular topic. The next topic are the mood disorders, and typically in abnormal psych, you'll get 1 to 2 chapters on these family of disorders. We're going to focus on 2, that of major depression and bipolar disorder. But again, these are not the only members of this family. Major depression is so common that it's often called the common cold of mental illness. Let's consider symptoms, and then we'll consider suicide warning signs. You'll have to go to the next slide, though. Let's consider the role of neurotransmitters in major depression. It appears that it is typical that the person would have deficiencies in 2 particular neurotransmitters. Do you remember the neurotransmitters we associate with mood disorders? Norepinephrine would be one, the other would be serotonin. Most medications used on depression work on both or one or the other one of these 2 neurotransmitters. And you might wonder, if the neurotransmitters play such a pivotal role, then why don't we just always use medication, or why don't we just skip the therapy? Well, therapy, as it works, actually does alter the neurotransmitters, and to the extent that the person is learning to address behavioral issues, environmental issues, often the medications are no longer needed in the future. If the person is just relying on the medications, often the beneficial effects of the medications stop when the person takes them. Additionally, some medications have significant side effects. Now, these can often be adjusted by adjusting the amount of medication or changing medications, but therapy is usually the best choice rather than medications. Though as a society, we're much more inclined to want to have a pill to address an issue than to talk to somebody to understand the roots of the disorder and to learn behavioral coping strategies. I would consider suggesting that you might consider therapy, and a first step could be visiting Mrs. King, our fabulous counselor at SCCC. Let's consider these common symptoms of major depression. A person does not necessarily have to have all of them to have major depression. First one, extreme sadness, extreme hopelessness. Very, very typical. Anger is variable. Some people are very angry, others are not. Next one is very, very typical, loss of interest and withdrawal. They withdraw from people. And so they feel they feel worse and they do less, and they feel worse and they do less. A vicious circle. Lack of energy. So the idea of getting out of bed might be all that they can handle. The idea of taking a shower, brushing your teeth, might require more energy than the person can muster. Because of this lack of energy, sometimes the hygiene gets very poor. Maybe a person that was formerly dressed perfectly, maybe her shoes matched her purse if she was a woman,
now might not change clothes for days. Again, might not shower for days, might not brush their teeth for days. Lack of hygiene is a common symptom. Change in appetite. I try to keep it vague. Some people eat a lot more, some people eat a lot less, though the eating a lot less is more common. Next, let's consider the ability to feel pleasure. It's diminished or even fully lost in depression. Because of this, a major motivator of human behavior has been lost. Often linked to that is the person has no interest in sexuality. Another common change is change in sleep. It could be more or less, but most typically people sleep many hours more a day. And biologically, this is a very bad choice. REM sleep well over the normal limit makes depression worse. So biologically, they're doing something that will actually make their episodes worse than they would have been. Another common feature is loss of self-esteem. Even if they had normal healthy self-esteem before, self-esteem plummets. For example, why should I apply for that scholarship? They'll never pick me. Why should I bother doing the paper? I'll never pass it. So loss of self-esteem, very common. And if all of these are present, or even many or most, a person probably will have thoughts of suicide, which is our next topic. We'll now consider the topic of suicide. For some people, this will be a very difficult topic. If this brings up unpleasant memories and associations, you might want to consider reaching out to our in-house counselor, Mrs. King. She's gone virtual over the break, and she is very available to help you with any issue that you might like. I'll guarantee you she is very easy to talk to, very professional, and it will be a very good experience for you if you want to reach out to her. Let's consider our first item. True or false, most suicides occur without warning signs. If you said false, you are incorrect. It is a true statement. So importantly, we should see if we would be able to recognize that warning sign if it was present. So take a moment and list symptoms that might indicate a person is suicidal. Don't list as symptoms of depression beyond symptoms of depression. What would make you think that that person might be suicidal? Let's consider some of these warning signs. One warning sign might be any reference to death and dying, or any fascination with death and dying. It could be casual reference. It could be, I'll miss doing that with you. And you puzzle and you think, we do this every week. It could be a lyric in a poem, a lyric in a song, a part of a poem, a short story. So reference to death and dying or fascination with the subject is a distinct warning sign. Another sign, the person gives away objects of theirs, especially prized possessions. Another warning sign could be self-injury. Another warning sign could be getting organized and doing a lot of cleaning. Try to think why getting organized could be problematic. So remember, this person probably has low energy, so why are they spending on organizing and cleaning? Well, sometimes they're trying to make it easier for the person who has to clean up their worldly possessions, their apartment, their room, after they die. So this is not a time to be organizing or cleaning. Another warning sign is tying up loose ends, making amends after fights. So pulling together loose strings in relationships, not a good time for this. And the last warning sign can be easily missed even by professionals. Let's say the person is hospitalized and is very depressed, and they're going to get a weekend pass maybe for Easter or Hanukkah or whatever holiday they might be celebrating. And their mood is much, much improved. And they're released. It's hard to know if they were happy because they were looking forward to seeing their friends and family and pet, or if they were looking for the opportunity to commit suicide. Depression works slowly. Medication works slowly. So if you see a rapid turnaround, rapid from being depressed to feeling good, even elated, either they're not suffering from major depression, or perhaps they're contemplating suicide. So just as it's very important to know the symptoms of a heart attack, it's also very important to know the symptoms that one is suicidal. Number 2, Suicidal people usually have diagnosable psychological problems. That is true. Can you think of some? Go ahead, think of some. Well, certainly the mood disorders like major depression or bipolar disorder, but what about some non-mood disorders? Schizophrenia, for example, has high rate, as well as substance abuse issues. One of the personality disorders we'll talk about has a particularly high risk. So it is very typical that the person would indeed have one or more untreated or insufficiently treated mental disorders. Next, most people who commit suicide leave a note. But that would be false. It's a fairly small number, 5%, maybe 10%. Think of the reasons why. Lack of energy, in part, maybe wanting to have people think it's an accident. So that person that gets drunk and hits a tree and dies, many people will think an accident, but may not be. A person that gets drunk and goes swimming in a lake and drowns, most people would say accident, not necessarily. In some states, in order to be listed as a suicide, there must be a note. So that probably jumped out at you that suicides are greatly, greatly underreported in terms of government statistics. The next one, suicide is in the top 5 causes of death in the U.S. Thank goodness, no, it is number 11, though it depends very much on the age of the person. But next, let's consider number 5, the sex. Women attempt suicide more often than men. What did you think? Indeed, it is true, women attempt. The word is attempt. Men have a greater lethality, but women do indeed attempt more often. Next, let's consider age. Teens and young adults are at the highest risk for suicide. I know you want to say true, but it is false. I know we think of the Romeo and Juliet imagery. Let's consider the person that is the most likely to do it. This person would be male. He would be over 50 and probably well over 50. He's newly alone. And how do you get to be newly alone at 50? Well, divorce can happen at any age or separation. It could be that the person died. It could be the person has Alzheimer's and is sitting right next to them, but fully unavailable. But men are at higher risk. Also, in terms of other demographics of that particular gentleman, he is likely to have health problems, and related to the loss of that partner, financial problems. When you scroll that all together, that is the person that is at highest risk. Next, after a famous person commits suicide, is there a temporary increase in the suicide rate? Yes, there is. Can you think of the type of learning we learned about in Chapter 5? What type of learning would say, of course, there would be an increase? Was it operant, classical, habituation, trial and error, social learning? Indeed, social learning, when a model is observed and imitated. And it doesn't have to be a famous person. It could be a person in the high school that you never even met. Counselors and teachers in high schools and junior high schools know to step up counseling after a suicide because people who are thinking about it now have a role model. Let's now consider about talking or hinting about suicide. If they talk about or hint about it, not cause for worry, because if they are serious, they would have attempted it. Hopefully that screams out at you as false. Well, how about the opposite side of the coin? If the person's depressed and has not mentioned it, is not hinted about it, then you should not worry. Again, that's false. So basically, if you find yourself worrying that somebody that you know might be suicidal, chances are you are picking up warning signs and you should be worried. But what to do after worry? Let's look at the next question. It is dangerous to ask a depressed person if they are thinking about suicide. False. They maybe have major depression, but they're not lacking in intelligence. They have schizophrenia, but they're not lacking in intelligence. So if they're that depressed, they are thinking about it. You're not going to give them the idea. It's like parents who will not talk to their kids about drugs or sex because they will give them the idea. Well, guess what? They have the idea. Last one. A college student is less likely to commit suicide than is a similar person not attending college. Well, there's many benefits of college education. One of them is greatly enhanced by several $100,000 lifetime earning. But is suicide risk reduction a benefit? I know that college can be very stressful in the best of times, much less the COVID times, but indeed, people who have attended college are less likely to commit suicide. In part, we know more about mental illness. We know about treatments. We know that help is available. So these questions are important, but also the reasons why these questions are also very important. Now let's consider another mood disorder, that of bipolar disorder. Do you know the older name for it? If you're thinking manic depression, you are correct. And both these names are very frequently and interchangeably used. How common is it? Well, we said major depression was the common cold of mental illness. But what about bipolar disorder? It is actually rare, about 1 or 2% of the general population. What is it? The person has periods of depression, just like we got done discussing a few moments ago, as well as periods of mania, or we can say it, periods in which there's a manic state. Hence, the person has manic depression. Now, if you're not familiar with the term mania, as it's used professionally in this context, perfectly fine. But let's fix that. In general, mania is referring to a state that is opposite of depression. So go back to your previous slide, and together let's look at these characteristics of depression and see which ones are the same in mania and which ones are the opposite. And I think you'll be struck by the number that are the opposite. To make your life easier, I might suggest that you go back to your notes on the common symptoms of depression that we listed, and then put another column on the other side and put for mania. So let's look at them. Extreme sadness. If a person's manic, are they extremely sad? No, that would be an opposite. It's almost like a euphoria, often almost like a high. Many times people do not want to take their meds because it would take away this very pleasurable feeling. Next one, hopelessness. That's also typically opposite. People in the manic phase are often feeling very good. Anger, that one is very variable. Irritation, yes. Anger, typically not. So we'll put that in the opposite column. Loss of interest in withdrawal, what do you think? That too would be opposite. Think of the image of the Energizer Bunny. Often interested in many things, interacting with people more, so you might get, instead of your 4 texts a day from the person, you might get 8 or 9. You might get a text at 4 in the morning. So often reaching out and doing much more interaction. We said in major depression, lack of energy, typically the opposite, again, our Energizer Bunny picture. Next one is lack of hygiene. I'm going to skip that one because that is so incredibly variable, so we really can't generalize on that one. Change in appetite. This is one of the few that are the same. Both of these individuals will probably eat very little, but for opposite reasons. The depressed person is too depressed and hopeless and has no appetite. The person in a manic phase is too busy, just like if you just exercise, you're not in the mood to eat. So same behavior, but opposite reason. So I'm going to still put that as a chalk in the opposite column. What do you think about no pleasure? I guess it's time to feed the dog. I'll be back. We said that in major depression, the person loses the ability to feel pleasure. What do you think about the manic phase? Definitely the opposite. No interest in sex for major depression. What do you think about mania? Often an intense interest in sexuality, so that is often and typically opposite. Change in sleep. We said to people with major depression typically sleep much more than usual. A person with bipolar disorder in the manic phase would typically sleep much less. They might be quite comfortable with 4 or 5 hours a day sleeping when their normal might have been 8 or 9 or 10. Don't call it insomnia because they are feeling rested. Loss of self-esteem and major depression. Well, in the manic phase, opposite. A person might quit their dream job after college saying that they can do better. How hard is it to be a judge or an airline pilot? It can be that extreme. Thoughts of suicide, typically not in the manic phase, but after they leave and go into the depressed phase, yes. So again, another opposite. I would like to put on one last symptom on your list for bipolar disorder, the manic phase, poor judgment. A person in mania often shows very poor judgment, not due to their own fault. So to continue this point, a person that does have bipolar disorder needs to try to structure their life as much as possible to protect themselves from a manic phase. And if you have a partner that has bipolar disorder, you need to do the same thing as well. For example, a person in a manic phase might max out an entire checking account and start bouncing checks over town, max out a credit card. So it might be a good idea, if possible, to have a person who signs their checks with them to protect them. Probably only one credit card should be owned, and a low limit on that, which you have in writing, cannot be increased. A person with a manic phase who would never ever have a affair in 1,000 years could easily have an affair, so an STI check, including HIV, might be highly desirable after each manic phase. If you would never let your child in a car with a drunk person, you should never place your child in a car with a person that has a manic phase going on. So again, both the individual and people that are involved relationship-wise with this individual should definitely protect themselves as much as possible. Let's consider autism spectrum disorders. Previously, we would just refer to the condition as autism, but the DSM-5, the current one, now calls it a spectrum disorder. I like to start by saying it is definitively, according to experimental evidence, not caused by shots. I have the picture of Charlie Sheen on the right because he's a very staunch anti-vaxxer. So if you take your medical advice from Charlie Sheen, then maybe you should be very suspicious of autism being caused by shots. But if you want to put your faith in experimental evidence, go with the concept that it's not caused by shots. There have been many large-scale studies with tens of thousands of children in them. Some, their parents opted not to give shots. Some, their parents opted to give shots. Sorry about that, a colleague was reaching out to me. So if we had a large-scale study and we compared the rate of autism in children that were immunized versus children that were not immunized, if it's related to injections, you should see a higher rate in the immunized group, and this is not what research has found in study after study after study. The term Aspergers was used in the previous DSM, but is no longer recognized. Yet many people that are on the spectrum have Asperger's as part of their identity, and I respect this. Many are very upset by the removal of the Asperger's term, and I have sympathy, and I would be very irate if I were them also. Think of Asperger's, if we can say it, as being autism light. The person is definitely influenced, and their life is affected by the autism, and yet at a much lighter level than people that are fully on the spectrum. Let's look at the defining features. The defining feature is social deficits. A person on the spectrum will have social difficulties in a wide group of areas. For example, body language. You're probably never instructed on body language, but we learn to read it very naturally. A person on the spectrum is often oblivious to body language. They may stand too close. They might miss signs that you're bored or that you're irritated. Also, in terms of social deficits, if you don't particularly like group work, often they struggle with group work. Give and take in conversations, catering your conversation to your audience. These are all things that we often do instinctively, but a person with autism may have great trouble with. IQ is not particularly linked to spectrum. A person can be anywhere from 0 to genius, so highly variable. A symptom which may or may not be there in a person that is on the mild end of autism would be motor oddities. These might be motions like we call pill rolling. I wish I could show you that right now. Hand flapping, running on the tip of your toes. Rocking is a particularly common one in a severely autistic person. Again, motor oddities are often not found in the lightly affected individuals. Another feature that will be there invariably would be need for consistency. I always ask my students right now to think about the big 5 personality traits. That will be on your next test. Take a moment and think of the ocean mnemonic and see which one addresses this particular issue. So let's see, ocean. O is for openness to new experiences. C, was that consciousness or conscientiousness? Hopefully you went with conscientiousness. E was extroversion-introversion. A, agreeableness or aggression? Hopefully you went with agreeableness. And N, another toughie, neuroticism or narcissism? It would be neuroticism. But which one refers to need to consistency? Hopefully you went with the first one, openness to new experience, that dimension of being highly open to not open at all. They are clearly on the end of that dimension of not being open to new experience at all. So people on the spectrum are creatures of habit. They like tried, true, and familiar. They don't like variations in their routine. They need consistency. Maybe you do too. The most renowned expert on autism is Temple Grandin, who is severely autistic. You'll see a quote from her on a subsequent slide. Unlike people that are severely autistic, Temple Grandin has a PhD, so she can very clearly and eloquently explain what it's like to have severe autism. Another expert is pictured as authoring the books on the left, John Elder Robinson. I originally saw the far left book in a bookstore and it caught my eye, clearly being on the topic of autism, so I bought that and thought it'd be a very interesting read. Then I switched to his next book, Raising Cubby. It's about raising his son, who is also on the spectrum, and his wife, they later found out, is also on the spectrum. The two adults, John and his wife, found out in later life that they're autistic. The book is subtitled regarding high adventures and explosives, and it was a very interesting read. His last book describes an experiment that he participated in using a TMS, transmagnetic cranial stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it gave him the ability, for the first time ever, to fully understand other people's perspectives, and not all for the good. He was able to review the conversations he had through his entire life with a new perspective. People that he thought were friends were making fun of him. People that were business partners taking advantage of him. So this new ability to recognize people's emotions and internal mental states was a very mixed blessing for him. Many people on the spectrum don't particularly like the phrase on the spectrum. Many prefer the term neurodiverse, and I'm certainly very willing to adopt that term for people who prefer it. So let's look at some very famous neurodiverse people. We have Sir Isaac Newton on the left. Thomas Jefferson displayed all the characteristics of autism. Next picture, Bill Gates, who's been discussed as having probable characteristics. Einstein clearly was on the spectrum. Do you know this actress? I find that many of my students don't. She played in Splash, Clan of the Cave Bear, many movies. Her name is Daryl Hannah. The actor on the right, yes, the character is Conehead, but who is the actor? That would be Dan Aykroyd. So just a small sampling of famous neurodiverse people. As I mentioned in a previous slide, by far Temple Grandin is recognized as the most influential expert on autism. I'm not going to read the quote aloud, but read it yourself. This gives you a picture into how she thinks. Do not necessarily think that all people in autism think in pictures. This is a subtype of autism. Most do not. Let's reconsider 2 eating disorders, anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. You'll want to review your lecture notes from previous in the course because I could easily ask a question, but let me ask a very basic one. For which did we associate self-starvation or vomiting? The answer, I hope you went with both. The anorexic uses various strategies to get herself or perhaps himself, down to 85% or less of what that person should weigh given their height and body frame. The bulimic would use either one of those behaviors after a binge to compensate for the massive calories he or she has consumed. Let's consider IQ. In order to do the extremes, we have to know what the average is first. Do you know the average IQ? Think for a moment. 75? No, that's actually called borderline, almost intellectually disabled. The most average IQ would be 100. Given an intellectual disability would be the top and bottom 2% of the bell curve, so flip to the next page when you're done listening and write in the cutoff for giftedness and the cutoff for disability. Let's now consider one cause of intellectual disability, that of Down syndrome. Please look at all the captions in blue and fill in as many as you can based on your own knowledge. Now let's recover it starting from the beginning. Down syndrome is also called trisomy 21. Now somy, S-O-M-Y, is rather like soma. So basically you got 3 in body, telling you that in the cells of the individual's body, instead of having the typical number of 21st chromosomes, that is a pair, they have tri. They have 3 number 21 chromosomes. So if they have 3, how many chromosomes do they have in each cell? Well, they'd have that one extra, that making the third, so they would have, instead of 46, they would have 47. Its causes, therefore, are reflected in the scientific name, having an extra 21st chromosome, typically in every body cell. Risk factors would be age of mom. Apparently not age of dad. Older dads are far more likely to have autistic spectrum children, though. Let me give you 3 numbers that might surprise you in terms of how strongly age is related as a risk. Women that are with Down syndrome babies are often older women. At 30, her risk would be very low. About 1 in 1,000 babies would be conceived that have Down syndrome. So 1 in 1,000 at 30, very low risk. At 40, it jumps very substantially to 1 in 100, give or take. At mid to upper 40s, jumps to 1 in 10 or 1 in 12. So very surprising how age is implicated. Physical traits, well, body shape, if you're familiar with the individual's body shape, they won't be tall and lean. They'll typically be of shorter stature and much stockier in build. They will also typically have a particular facial profile, very flat face due to extra fat in the body, including the face. The tongue would often protrude out of the mouth, or the mouth is often open. Apparently it is not due to the tongue being bigger, but the space inside the jaw being smaller. Health problems. Unfortunately, people with Downs suffer very commonly very severe health problems. Did you guess any before? Heart problems are not uncommon. Sometimes heart surgery is performed on the baby while it's still in the womb. Other significant health problems include terrible immune systems in the days pre-antibiotics and pre-vaccines for flus. They commonly died in childhood or teens. Another common health problem would be Alzheimer's. They often get Alzheimer's in their 40s and 50s. So those are some of the significant health problems that are common in the Downs population. Psychological traits, well, they are intellectually disabled in terms of intellect, so that's a cognitive aspect of the psychological traits. In terms of emotional constitution, as compared to other people that are intellectually disabled or in population in general, they tend to be as a group happier, affectionate, more cheerful. Perhaps a partial compensation to the parents. Now let's consider ADHD. Earlier, it was ADD-H. Before that, it was minimal brain dysfunction. Let's look at the key features. There are two key features: inattention-related features and motor-related features. Inattention would include issues relating to lack of ability to pay attention, easily distracted, doesn't listen when given instructions, also highly disorganized, loses and misplaces things because of lack of attention. Motor behavior would include fidgeting, and many times students would be told, stop squirming, stop fidgeting. According to research, let them fidget, let them squirm. As long as they're not disrupting others, they will actually process information, or if it's you will process information better. Other motor symptoms include being highly talkative, also being highly impulsive. I tell my students, could you give me examples where being impulsive could either be highly embarrassing to the people around them or outright dangerous to that ADHD child? Think about it. So again, behaviors that might be related to impulsiveness that could be either highly embarrassing or dangerous. Related to embarrassing, well, just talking way too loud. Maybe talking impulsively. For example, Mommy, look at that woman's face. And of course, the parents would be cringing. How about dangerous? Well, if you thought of maybe running into the street after a ball or darting around a car on your bike, definitely, although all children are at risk for this, ADHD children are at much higher risk. But also, perhaps hugging a big dog walking down the street thinking the dog will be receptive, like the child's dog would be. Maybe jumping off of something at the playground or jumping out of a branch of a tree, not thinking about what would happen a few seconds later. Or consider this example given to me a few years ago by a student. She lived in a second-floor apartment. Her brother looked down to the alley and saw a beanbag chair in the alley. As you think about it, do you really think it was a beanbag chair? If not, what do you think it was? If you said a bag of garbage, you're correct. What did the child do? Open the window and jumped out into the garbage? Yep. And what happened when that child hit what they thought was going to be a beanbag chair? Injured? Yes. More specifically, on glass that was in the garbage bag. So again, that highly impulsive behavior. It also could include maybe jumping into a swimming pool when you don't know how to swim and you don't have your floaties on and there's no adult there. So again, this impulsive behavior can lead a child to repeated visits to an ER, which leads me to the next question I usually ask my students. Well, what happens when a child is a frequent flyer in an ER? If you're thinking a knock on the door by Department of Social Services, quite probably. And hopefully after a thorough investigation, they'll realize that there was no case here of parents abusing the child, though the other way around, maybe quite possibly. Next, let's consider the condition known as schizophrenia. Early in the course, we noted that it's perhaps the severest of all adult onset mental issues. How common? 1%. The way I like to look at 1% in class is a very big little number. Consider 1% of our college, our county, our state, our country, the world. This 1% is a very big little number. The cause? Much research has linked schizophrenia to too much of one particular neurotransmitter. Try to remember it. As a hint, it's also the neurotransmitter involved in Parkinson's. If you're saying dopamine, yes, you are correct. Too much dopamine. Severity, again, as we noted, considered to be the severest of all adult onset disorders. Let's look at defining characteristics next. Let's start with hallucinations and distinguish them from delusions. Many students confuse these on tests. What is the difference? Hallucinations are sensory. Think of our sense, sensation, and perception chapter. So they're false sensory experiences. The most common type is hearing things that are not physically present. particularly voices. The voices might be talking to you, or the voices might be talking about you. It is, though, possible to have hallucinations in other sensory modalities. Smelling things that are not there, typically not pleasant things like roses or flowers of other types. It might be more like body odors. Other hallucinations can be really any sensory modality. Visual, though, is particularly uncommon. Let's consider delusions. Delusions are one particular form of thought disturbance. We'll define delusion as an obviously false thought. There are many forms. In abnormal psych, you'll learn the forms and perhaps their names. I'll discuss them now with you, some of them, but you don't need to know of any of the names of specific types of delusions. Delusions that people are out to get you and harm you. That's paranoia. Delusions that things that happen in the world, all of them directly relate to you. So if a bridge is out, it's because they didn't want you to succeed, because they wanted you to be late to work and get fired. Other delusions, that your thoughts are being broadcast from your mind and other people are able to listen to them or read them, or the thoughts are being inserted directly into your mind, or somebody famous is romantically interested in you, and other types as well. So delusions are always obviously false thoughts. But a person with schizophrenia is not only typically hallucinating and delusional, they will almost always have other thought problems as well, such as, for example, jumping from idea to idea. We call it loosely connected thoughts, but they're so loosely connected to not be connected at all. Let me read this short excerpt for you. This is a person interviewing somebody who is actively in a schizophrenic episode. The interviewer asks, "Have you been nervous or tense lately?" The person replies, "No, I have a head of lettuce." The interviewer is puzzled and asks for an explanation. The person explains that, well, lettuce is a transformation of a dead cougar that suffered a relapse on a lion's toe, and Gloria and Tommy, they're not whales but are two heads and escaped with herds of vomit. So clearly, just a random jumble of ideas. So even though not connected at all, we would often use the term loosely connected thoughts for their particular thought issue. We would also typically see odd behaviors, and in the video clip, you will see some distinctly odd behaviors. Also typically odd emotions. The emotion that the person displays does not seem to fit the environmental context they're in. For example, a close friend of mine has an adult child that is schizophrenic, and when she watched the 911 news footage on the evening news, he was laughing and laughing. Clearly, his emotions didn't fit the surrounding and the circumstance. Next, please go to the two videos. One will show you the individual that is not being treated successfully at the time of his hospitalization. This is older footage, so I'm hopeful that with the second round of medications that they were able to successfully help them. The other clip is a simulation, which will show you what it's like to have an active schizophrenic episode. It's very dramatic, so be prepared. This second clip has two parts. One starts showing a person moving through a typical house on a typical day. That's probably pretty much what you did this morning. So you can feel free to skip through it until you get to the point where you see the window open and the curtains blowing in the breeze and a bright sunlit day. Right after that, it switches and shows you that same person, that same morning, from a schizophrenic point of view. I'll also say on the first clip, if it's helpful, that you can stop watching the first clip after the individual and his mother and doctor all go to sit down on the long rectangular table. If you want to continue watching it, it's fine, but I'll only be asking questions up to the point that you see them sitting down at that table. Let's now consider the personality disorders. There are long-standing maladaptive patterns of three things. Take a moment and see if you can guess. If you said thinking, feeling, and acting, or similar forms of those words, you are indeed correct. But be careful, again, not every time you see three blanks will be thinking, feeling, and acting. It could be id, ego, superego. If it's talking about developmental psychology, the answer would be physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional. The difference between our definition of personality and personality disorders is that these patterns in the disorders are maladaptive. In other words, not in your best interests. So, non-helpful patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. 10 are recognized. If you take abnormal psychology, you will learn about all 10. For this course, we'll focus on 2, the most researched 2, and in many ways, the most dramatic. Let's start with borderline personality disorder first. The key feature of borderline personality disorder is a fundamental lack of stability. You might ask, in what areas? In all areas. The way they think is often dramatic and often changes. For example, political views, their environmental issues. You would often see a great deal of instability. So in thinking, also in emotions, their emotions would tend to be very erratic. Just because they were in a very good mood when you saw them before class does not at all mean that they'll be in reasonably even a semi-good mood after class. Also, their behaviors are very erratic, often all over the place. One of the key features, though, is that they cannot tolerate being alone. It causes them great stress to the point that they sometimes self-injure, such as cutting behavior or even taking a cigarette to their own flesh. When very stressed out, they can self-injure or even attempt or even successfully complete suicide. This disorder does have a distinctly higher suicide risk than for many other disorders. They also can cause chaos, whether it's your suite in your group project or at your work. They often will create instability. A very different disorder is antisocial personality disorder. Most students think, well, this person is fundamentally shy. They're an extreme introvert. Nothing further could be from the case. What could be the other name of this disorder? If you're criminal justice, you might be thinking the correct thing. Sociopath. This person is a sociopath. Key feature? Lack of morality. No morality whatsoever. Let's do a quick review. Morality, what was our C word, our C term for morality? Conscience. So they have no conscience, no sense of morality. Again, we know the CRJ term, criminal justice that is, sociopath. Other common features? This person is a risk taker. Don't dare them to do anything. They probably will. Extreme behaviors are enticing to them. They have no empathy for others, even if you're a supposed friend, a family member, a child. No empathy. Many people think that they must commit criminal behaviors. Very untrue. They do not necessarily commit crimes. They do not respect others. They do not care about others' emotional states, but they do not necessarily commit crimes. Can you think of any professions that you might actually do better if you didn't have a moral compass? I'll let you think about that. So, good legal careers for the sociopath. Sometimes I hear hitman. No, hitman is not a legal career. Legal careers might be perhaps the used car salesman. A poor student from SCCC needs a safe car to take her child to daycare, to get to work, to get to school, and our sociopath might happily sell her the lemon of the lot, winning the lottery maybe of who sells that lemon. So used car salesman, perhaps. CEO, who might drive a company into financial ruin. People lose their bankruptcy, their jobs, people lose their homes, yet often will reward themselves hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars of bonus. Maybe a lawyer. Now, most lawyers have a very highly developed moral and ethical code, but if you didn't have one, maybe defending people that you actually knew were murderers or, say, child molesters might make your life considerably easier. But again, most people with antisocial personality disorder do not commit crimes. The reverse of that, though, if you look at people in prisons and jails, A great number of them are there because of antisocial personality disorder. Before we leave this chapter, I'd like you to consider that a person who seeks mental health help, who seeks a mental health therapist, does not necessarily have a mental illness. Very often they do not. Instead, what brings them to therapy is what we term problems of living. It could be academic. For example, you failed out one college and you've gone to a secondary college and you're failing out this college too due to your behavior. Well, then maybe the therapist can help you adjust your behavior so that you might be more successful. Other times, maybe difficulty within the parent-child relationship. Maybe job difficulties. Maybe you've lost 2 jobs because of certain behaviors of yours, and you're on your way to losing your 3rd job, and you decide that you need to seek mental health help. It might be bereavement, a loss of a partner, a child, a friend, a great loss in your life that you need help coping with. Or instead of parent-child relationship issues, maybe it's issues in the relationship with your partner. So again, a person does not need a mental disorder in order to benefit from mental health help. Consider as an analogy, if you own a car, invariably the car is going to need a tune-up every now and then to run effectively, and people are very much like cars in this regard. Sometimes we can greatly benefit from a tune-up ourselves.